and welcome back to Reverse Shot. I'm your host, Brian Karam. This is the show where we take a look at the foibles of the daily press and what we do right and what we do wrong. And, you know, I want to start this week out. As we all know, there was a debate this week between presidential candidates, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President, that guy, Donald Trump. Yes, I was imitating what Harris did at one point in time instead of saying what she really thought about it. But anyway, let's talk about that debate. There's been a lot of criticism of the press and coverage of these debates. There's been a lot of criticism of the press in the moderation of these debates. In fact, both Republicans and Democrats have criticized ABC and David Muir and Lindsey Davis for their efforts in moderating this debate. But let me tell you, it was a lot better than the CNN debate. I'm going to show you a couple of clips and point out exactly what it is that we did right for a change. Starting with David Muir when he talked to Donald Trump about, yes, that's right, cat and dog eating. Take a look.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame.
I just want to clarify here. You bring up Springfield, Ohio, and ABC News did reach out to the city manager there. He told us there have been no credible reports of specific claims of pets being harmed, injured, or abused by individuals within the immigrant community.
Well, I've seen people on television.
Let me just say here, this is
the people on television say my dog was taken and used for food. So maybe he said that, and maybe that's a good thing to say for a city manager.
I'm not taking this from television.
But the people on television saying their dog was eaten by the people that went there.
Again, the Springfield city manager says there's no evidence of that. Vice President Harris, I'll let you respond to the rest of what you've heard.
You talk about extreme.
Citing a city manager and facts, David Muir essentially broke Donald Trump down. That's how you moderate a debate. But the best, I think, came from Lindsey Davis. And it came when Donald Trump continued to press the idea that the Democrats somehow are in favor of postpartum abortions. That's right, after-birth abortions. That's called murder, folks. And this is exactly what she had to say about that.
Because they're radical. The Democrats are radical in that. And her vice presidential pick, which I think was a horrible pick, by the way, for our country, because he is really out of it. But her vice presidential pick says abortion in the 9th month is absolutely fine. He also says execution after birth. It's execution, no longer abortion, because the baby is born, is okay.
There is no state in this country where it is legal to kill a baby after it's born.
Two great cases of when we actually did our job. Now, I have some criticisms of how they moderated the debate. There was one point in time where Muir pressed Donald Trump on his calling up and asking for legislation, bipartisan legislation on immigration to be put aside so he could campaign on it rather than fix it. Great question, just didn't follow up on it. But that's a minor point. At the end of the day, both Democrats and Republicans were upset with him. The Republicans, of course, saying that Donald Trump was fact-checked too much, which only means that's an admission of the fact that he lied too much. And, of course, Democrats didn't like the fact that Donald Trump got more time than the vice president. I think he responded maybe half a dozen or a dozen more times in the hour and a half or hour and 45 minutes and spoke for about 5 minutes more than she did. But these are minor complaints. Honestly, that's how you moderate a debate. You keep the contestants, the combatants, those who are debating, on track, answering questions, and you hold them to their time. That's what you do. They tried their best to do it. They get good grades from me on that. Nonetheless, since then, that has been all chopped up, put on the internet and on social media, and Donald Trump is claiming victory. Donald Trump is claiming there is cats and dogs being eaten in the streets. The Haitian refugees are being assaulted and insulted. And look, folks, this is one of the big problems that we have today. Not just what we call legacy or corporate media, but the media, the independent media that has spawned from the internet. And we're going to take a good look at that problem right here and right now with someone who really knows. Hi, we are back. It is Reverse Shot. I am your host, Brian Karam. With me now is Paul Barrett, the Deputy Director of the Center of Business and Human Rights at New York University's Stern School of Business. And Paul, that's a mouthful, but I'm impressed with what you've done, including you're an author, you're a former reporter, former editor. You called yourself earlier a lone wolf, but you've also led investigative teams, so you know our business. And that's important, I think, as we go forward talking about with people who know the business about the problems in the business. But I want to talk to you. I guess it's, as I was told and as I read, it's the most recent report reviewed 400 social science studies to find that social media's role in exacerbating online intimidation and violence in the real world. That is also a mouthful, but I'll let you unpack it. Just tell me, what does this tell us about social media?
Well, we've had a sort of a rolling debate over the last, I'd say, 7-8 years over what effects social media is having on democracy and society at large. And one of the components of that debate has been the question of what social science tells us about that question. And the industry has been quite aggressive in asserting that, oh, well, we really can't tell what social science says. It's all a big muddle, and nothing's conclusive. And what you should infer from all of that is that social media is not really having much effect on people's political views or their political activity, which is pretty laughable right on the surface. Anyone who was sentient on January 6, 2021 and was aware of the circumstances that surrounded the riot at the United States Capitol knows that social media was one of the main instruments, not the only instrument, but one of the main instruments that was deployed by everyone from the then president of the United States on down through the ranks of his supporters to spread the ideology about election denialism and related ideas, to organize the protests that were then carried out at the Capitol, and right down to the actual execution of the activities at the Capitol that day, some of which were planned and carried out via social media platforms in real time, with the president at the White House on YouTube egging on his supporters. So that episode, which is only, of course, one episode, hints at what the role of social media. But there are many, many episodes that are similar to that one, if less dramatic, and equally dramatic, including mass shootings, systematic terrorism by organizations ranging from ISIS to Hamas to others, where social media plays a role. So we decided to sort of take on this question of what does the social science say about the relationship between social media on the one hand and political intimidation and violence on the other. And with the help of some fellow researchers, we looked through hundreds of social science studies, both those published in peer-reviewed journals and those produced by think tanks and by academic policy centers like ours at NYU. And the overwhelming conclusion is that social media does, in fact, play an enabling role. So what do I mean by enabling? We've had political violence since time immemorial. We're not saying that Mark Zuckerberg or his counterparts at YouTube or TikTok invented political intimidation and violence. We're not saying that they even want to see political intimidation and violence. We're saying that at this moment in history, the technologies that they've invented and deployed and from which they profit mightily are being exploited by people who pursue political intimidation and violence. And over in a variety of contexts, in a wide range of geographies all around the world, the social science research illustrates not only that social media is enabling the recruiting of extremists, the informing of extremists with hateful and violent ideologies, and the actual deployment in just practical terms of people to get involved in particular acts of intimidation and violence, that this has been demonstrated chapter and verse. And we try to distill all of that research with a particular focus on how particular platforms play this role. So in other words, what are the features of particular platforms that make them so susceptible to exploitation in this regard? So that's what our most recent report gets at.
So let me unpack that a little bit. I was there January 6th. There was no doubt to me. I heard the president speak. I heard him talk to them. I saw what was posted. You have a wonderful op-ed that I've read probably 4 or 5 times now. The lead photograph of people climbing up the wall on January 6th is the photograph that leads off this particular piece. And I was standing there as I saw them climb up the wall, and I said, "Hey, morons, there's steps on either side. If you don't be careful, you should take the steps. Somebody's going to fall and break their neck." Somebody did. They came after me. Every single one of them that I saw that day were either on the same Facebook page or some other social media page, Twitter, talking to each other, picking up. So I get, to me, you don't have to tell me that there's a link, but how, and I'm with you. I understand that, it wasn't invented with the purpose being let's create and foment destruction, but the disinformation is much easier spread when you have instantaneous communications. If you've got everybody in a chat room, all of that makes sense to me. It doesn't, and for anyone to say that it has no effect, I simply say that use your common sense. It's like-minded people getting together, and you could do it. It could be people getting together to talk about flowers or my favorite lake, but when you have people who are intent on creating disturbance, it makes it very easy for them to do it. I get all of that, and you really don't have to. I mean, I don't know that it takes a social study course for that, but what you did put in this, what I really like was what you broke down as far as how to combat the problem. And so let's talk. There's in what we can do in the media. And it's called ways to reduce harm. You say sound the alarm, put more people on content moderation beat, confront election delegitimization, make design changes to mitigate harm. If we can break those down, first of all, how do you sound the alarm? How do you think is the best way for people in our business, my business, to sound the alarm?
Yeah. Well, that particular exhortation is actually aimed at the social media companies.
I know, but
which are quite distinct from obviously news organizations, and that it is a call for these companies to take responsibility for the side effects of their business activities, which are pernicious. My comparison for this is a factory that sits at the edge of town that may make useful products that the residents of the town use in their lives, but which has a tall smokestack that belches out pollution. And if the owners of the factories don't take responsibility for that, and the government in question doesn't step in and regulate the pollution, then you've got a problem. That's what we have here. We have information pollution. We have a technologically generated cesspool of hateful and harmful expression, which is difficult for the government to regulate in a direct way because it's expression, and because it's difficult to distinguish between ordinary politics and the type of expression that you'd have the government intervene over. But the first step is for these companies themselves to take some responsibility, which they have simply failed to do. There are things the companies themselves can do unilaterally to basically tinker with, first of all, the design features that characterize their platforms. You can start with things that are very, very basic, such as anonymity. A big part of the reason why people feel so free to abuse social media and spread hateful ideas and organize and intimidation campaigns, attacking election workers, to switch context for a minute, attacking public health authorities who are just trying to get people vaccinated, and so forth, is because they operate anonymously, and that's not
But isn't
dictated by
that,
nature.
but gosh, Paul, isn't that free speech? Just letting people speak?
Well, it is free speech, but free speech comes with a cost, and I'm not calling for the government to mandate that people stand behind that their identities be verified, because I wouldn't have the government mandate that. That is what the First Amendment is all about, restricting the kind of regulation that government can do. But in this context, we're talking about large companies that operate these venues, these platforms, and the companies are perfectly free to regulate the platforms however they see fit. They are not affected by the First Amendment, and in fact, they need to set limits. And one of the basic limits would simply be to require people to identify themselves and then to verify their identity in some non-intrusive way. I'm not talking about sending people to your house to check out who you are, but simply to provide, some type of relevant confirmation of who you are. I think you'd see an immediate fall off of the
Of
level
course
of
you would.
extremism if people simply had to take responsibility for what they were saying.
Well, all right. So two things come to mind with that. You're absolutely right. I agree. In fact, I wrote a book called Free the Press where I pointed this out directly. Same thing. I said the exact same thing. And here's the pushback. And I was being facetious, of course, about, well, gosh, won't it squelch their free speech? Because that's what I always hear. But it won't. Free speech incurs responsibility. Speak up and be who you are. You're free to say it, but we should be free to be able to identify who you are so we know. But the problems you're going to run across, and let's be honest, you're going to get rid of the troll farms, which make them tons of money because those people are anonymous for a reason. They don't exist, correct? I mean, a lot of these people are merely creative figments of someone's imagination, and they can put 10 or 12 of them out there and drive disinformation by not being responsible for who they are. So what's the incentive to make companies make people that honest?
Yeah. Well, then you can begin to talk about the types of regulation that are tolerable under the First Amendment, and an approach that I've advocated now over a number of years, which I allude to in this report, but have expanded on in other white papers and in other contexts, is to enhance the authority that the government has, particularly the Federal Trade Commission, to protect, to enforce consumer protection. We have a whole body of law, and there are decades of experience in enforcing that law, where you require companies to disclose information about how they operate without dictating to them what they can say, or dictating to them what opinions they should have. And under the rubric of consumer protection, you can, for example, in my view, and this is not unique to me, there have been bills proposed in the United States Congress which basically embrace this same approach. You can ask companies, what procedures do you use for reviewing content and enforcing the policies that you yourself set? In other words, the government doesn't set the policies.
Right.
The companies set the policies, but then the companies should be forced to uphold the policies, which are in effect promises to consumers to run their business in a certain way. So that if a car company promises we're going to have engines in our cars and seat belts in the passenger compartment, the government can come in and say, hey, do you really have seat belts? Do you really have engines in your cars? Or are you operating a flim-flam operation and just ripping people off? Analogously, and the government has to be more cautious when it's talking to social media companies because they are in the speech business. But with due caution, they could say, how many content moderators do you employ? How do your content moderators interact with the automated systems, the AI-driven systems that you also operate? Are you devoting the resources to these pursuits that are necessary in order to enforce what they call the community standards or the community guidelines that you yourself have set out in your terms of service as being the basis for how you operate? And with this cautious, consumer protection oriented approach, the government could shed a great deal more light on how companies are actually operating. And I think that would allow us to travel a good distance toward essentially shaming the companies into taking responsibility. If they were forced to reveal how they were operating to a much greater degree than they are now, I think you would see much more of a public demand that they operate more responsibly. Along the same lines, you could force them without without restricting their speech in any way. You could force them to allow outside researchers, people like me, people like the PhD, economists and computer scientists and others, access to the data that they have that will illustrate to a greater degree than we now understand, for example, why certain types of content in the lingo of social media goes viral and other content doesn't. And if we had more of a direct hands-on understanding of that, we would see that the business models of these companies are set up to promote sensational content, because that's the content that drives engagement, a term of art which refers to people commenting, people sharing, people liking, people disliking, etc. And that all of those activities captured by the idea of engagement is one of the key metrics that the advertisers use for determining whether they're going to buy advertising or not. And again, if there was a better understanding of how that engagement / advertising business model operated, I think the companies would be forced to sort of admit that they're not doing what ordinary common sense driven people would expect them to do, and we would move toward a much more substantive, constructive debate about the responsibilities this industry owes to the rest of society.
You want to look at the algorithms, brother.
Well, you don't even necessarily need to, you get into a debate there about intellectual property,
Yes.
and forcing companies to cough up their, secret sauce. You don't have to actually see the original lines of coding in order for, I can't do this, but a computer scientist working alongside a data scientist can explain to a greater degree without publicizing the code itself. They could do studies that would show how the code, when assembled into an algorithmic program, is in fact promoting the worst of the internet, as opposed to doing what Mark Zuckerberg wants you to think he's doing, which is, I'm merely connecting people. I'm merely letting everybody show everybody else their vacation photographs and their thoughts, as you said, on their favorite vacation spots. All of which is fine, and those platforms do that. And they do a lot of other, much even more important and constructive things. They facilitate education. They facilitate all kinds of small businesses. I assume you put your podcasts and other media activities onto social media platforms.
Of course.
There's a lot of good stuff going on. The point here is not to ban social media. It's not to restrict it in some broad way. The point is to try to hold it to higher standards so that this industry does what it promises it does, which is to say makes a constructive contribution to society, and even, God forbid, helps promote democracy as opposed to undermining democracy.
Yeah. Well, and that, let me go back to the analogy that you started with when we began this conversation about, you have the industry at the end of town who's doing some great things, but, it's belching smoke into the environment. I understand, in your editorial, you are talking about social media, but in my business, there's things that I want to circle back around to that, because I've found that those recommendations that you have are applicable to, corporate media, consumer media, legacy media, however you want to label what it is that we do. There are things that we could do better to alert the public that, hey, there is this wonderful, industry at the end of the town, but folks, it's belching smoke into the. We have to continue to let people know that it's that there are bad things that go along with the good things, and we need to look at them. So that's what, those the recommendations that you have, ways to reduce harm. What I really liked was putting more people on this spoke directly to me. Put more people on the content moderation beat. The simple fact of the matter is, and you correct me if I'm wrong, you know far better than I, but it seems to me that one of the biggest problems that we have in my business is that we don't understand that business very well. We can't put people there covering it very well because there are people like you who get it, but you've dedicated, that's your professional endeavor. You've got some young reporter who's on the beat. They don't get it because they don't have the background in it. They don't have the knowledge. Is there a way to overcome that, to let people know? I mean, other than, I'll confess, I'm endeavoring to do it right now, just talking to you. But what do you recommend that we do in the press to alert people to the problem?
Yeah. Well, I think what's necessary is nothing less than a complete paradigm shift, a complete changing of mentality. The press, as you and I grew up with it, going all the way back, I suppose to when we were students in the 1970s, and then cub reporters in the 1980s. At least that's when I started.
I'm right there with you.
Right. We understandably saw the news business as a coherent undertaking. There were companies. The companies owned printing presses. They employed people to run those presses, and they also employed people like you and me to go out into the world with pads and pencils and interview people and come back and in the 70s and early 80s sit at typewriters, and then by the late 80s maybe computers, and then by the 90s those computers began to get connected to one another in something called the internet. But that world is largely gone. And unfortunately, I think legacy media still thinks along the lines as if that world is still the model. And journalists simply need to understand that the technological barriers between what they're doing and what the whole rest of the world is doing in terms of communicating, ranging from TikTok influencers over to YouTube, channel proprietors who are, very ideologically driven, over to people battling over the virtue of vaccinations on Facebook, that these are now all part of a continuum. And journalists, in order to be effective, have to understand that whole continuum and understand how to put serious journalism out into the world. And we're in an environment where there really are only a handful of traditional organizations that are doing journalism in the full-fledged way that we were trying to do it in the 80s and into the 90s. And everybody else is trying to come up with new paradigms. So you've got new digital native nonprofit journalism organizations scrapping and trying to stay afloat. Many of them are very high quality, but need a lot more support. You've got just a whole plethora of different types of organizations. And out of this chaos and out of all this diversity of approaches will come whatever the new news industry is. And I don't know what shape that's going to ultimately take. We are in a transitional period where the paradigm has shifted, and we can't pretend that most journalists are going to operate within an organization like the New York Times, which, by the way, just to take one example, is one of the mountains that has survived as the rest of the terrain has turned into sort of a dystopia of information collapse. The New York Times has survived because they figured out the internet, and they set up revenue flows coming from cooking recipes and logic games and getting rid of your traditional sports department and buying a digital native sports department called The Athletic, and mixing and matching and all these things. some of which is good, some of which is bad, but it contributed to the brand name surviving, and they can still employ however many journalists they have, 1,500 journalists or whatever they have. But that's the exception. That's the throwback.
And they get criticized for that all the time.
Well, they do. And
Yeah.
I'm not holding the New York Times up as a paragon of anything. I'm just saying they're a paragon of survival, of
Yeah.
brand preservation.
Yeah, that's
But the basic answer to your question is that the new generations of journalists are going to have to see themselves as operating in a much more varied information environment, where they're going to have to fight to simply find a little island, something much smaller than the New York Times mountain, from which they can operate and try to put coherent, seriously researched, seriously reported news out into the world. I think, interestingly, there still is a demand
I
for
do
that
too.
type of information.
I do too.
It's just that the business model for gathering the information, synthesizing it, and putting it out to the world, the old business model has largely collapsed. And the question is what are the new business models that could conceivably replace it?
Well, I agree with that. I've told people that I think that you have to, if, for example, community journalism, think still has a place. Small community newspaper, but you're just not a newspaper. You're also a television station, a radio station, an internet provider, or social media presence. You've got to have all of it. You are, you're the one-stop shop for your community. If not, you're doomed. But how do you tell the reporter on the street, look, when you're and let's talk about the proximate man. So you're working for one of these new media companies. You want to warn people about the digital problem the digital factory down the road that's spewing the smoke into the environment. What do you recommend that reporters do first when they're looking at this type of endeavor, when they're looking at this business model?
Well, the very first thing is to maintain critical distance, to not just plunge into the pool of bullshit information and begin repeating it and spewing it out. Sometimes trying to contradict it, sometimes just embracing it. You need to keep critical distance from everything that's being spewed on everything from Twitter to TikTok and everywhere else, and not just become part of the maelstrom. So that's step number one, is to say, I'm something different. I'm a professional. I'm trying to practice a trade here, an honorable trade of gathering information, analyzing it, and then providing it to people in a way that's useful.
Well,
To do that,
right there.
you've got to.
I want to interrupt you right there, and I apologize for doing it, but you bring up a very important point, and I don't know if I'm saying it right, and you can correct me. But what I find abhorrent sometimes is that people repeat the disinformation in order to criticize the disinformation,
Right.
but in so doing, spread the disinformation.
Yeah,
How do you-
that's a big problem. It's not an easy one to solve either, but people have to be very, very careful about that. And we've seen this become so prevalent during the bizarre era that we've lived through since 2015, where during that era, since 2015, the dominant political figure in the country, whether he was in office or out of office, was also the chief digital disinformation purveyor. Of course, we're
Yes.
talking about Donald Trump. And so how does the political journalist, or the journalist in general, quote, cover, close quote, Donald Trump without sinking into the swamp of Donald Trump's falsehoods? Not easy to do. So the point here is not to say that there's an easy, straightforward formula, but the combination of the dominant political figure of an era with an emergent technology whose effects we don't fully understand, or at least until recently haven't fully understood, that has presented an enormous challenge to journalists. And I decided to get out of the full-time journalism game in 2017 and take primarily an academic job, where I still do a lot of writing, some of it in a journalistic vein, but I decided I had done my 30 years and it was time to move on.
You make it sound like a prison sentence, brother.
Well, I don't know about a prison sentence or a a long career in a civil service job, and you just time
Yeah,
to,
that same difference.
I've done my time.
Yeah.
Or as a dear friend of mine recommended to me around that time, he says, maybe it's just time to declare victory and leave the field of battle. Um,
I
so that
like that attitude.
Yeah, right. So, uh, but I have nothing but respect for my former colleagues who are still, of my generation, who are still battling it out, and all the younger generations who are still trying to work this out. And I don't think you can do this solo. I think you have to form organizations, even if small organizations, and those organizations can range from the well-funded, highly organized, super well-credentialed outfits like the Texas Tribune or ProPublica, over to outfits that really build themselves out of a single person who, starts a newsletter on Substack and then hires one person and then hires another person and then has something, there are people like Judd Legum, and others who are doing real reporting and making real contributions. But they need comrades. They need people they're working with. They need allies. So that's what we see right now. We see lots of different people trying to grope their way forward with all kinds of different models. And people are trying, making good, honorable efforts and failing. And that's going to happen too. Digital news organizations sort of began to blossom circa 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19. In the last few years, some of them have fallen back and fallen apart because they found it difficult to sustain their business models. So, there were outfits doing very good reporting on my area, tech policy, like BuzzFeed News, which started out as a silly listicle website and matured into a real news organization that had a real expertise on this topic, how social media operates. And now it's fallen back again because they couldn't quite figure out how to keep the revenue stream going. So this is not an easy thing. There's a poignancy to it and a sadness to it because I get asked all the time, since I now do some teaching, by students like, wow, your career was so terrific. How could I have a career like that? And my answer is you can't.
That's true.
The career path doesn't exist anymore.
No.
If you think there's a place to go sign up where you're going to get health insurance and a 401k, and you can then say, my goal for the next 15 years is just to get to the top of this organization, which is literally what I said when I signed on at the Wall Street Journal. I said, I've made it. I am now just going to learn, and I'm going to become one of the ace reporters at the Wall Street Journal. That's my mission. And I worked there for 18 years. And I was very, very lucky, really lucky. And then had the similar experience for another 12 years at Business Week, which became Bloomberg Business Week. But those paths are almost non-existent at this point. So people going into this field have to be much braver than I was, and I would say, than you were, when we had the aspiration to find an established organization that was going to pay us a salary, and we were going to dig in and do the job and learn it and get really good. Well, you're going to have to be much more flexible these days, much more opportunistic.
And well, on that, I'll ask you the final question I have for you. Are you hopeful for the future?
I'm a pessimist by nature. Across the board.
Oh, that's a reporter.
Right. But I think the source of hope is that there remains a demand for real news, and that there has been a healthy backlash against Trumpism and the attacks on the news, the notion that the media is the enemy of the people and all of that. And we just have to root for the good guys and hope that they overcome the bad guys in what really is a struggle. And I think that as long as there's demand, as long as people want and realize they need real information, fact-based information, in order to live happily wherever in their community in order to figure out who they want to vote for mayor and board of education, and ultimately for the United States president. As long as people understand those connections, I need information in order to live happily in a peaceful and constructive society, then eventually the news business will reformulate itself and provide and answer that demand, and provide what's being sought after.
Vetted,
But
factual.
that demand is not a force of nature, and it has to be cultivated itself. People have to consciously say, I need this, I want this. I need to explain to my children why they need this and they want this. Collectively, we've got to get together in organizations, that whether they're political organizations or social organizations. And if people, I think a lot of people have lost touch with that need,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and they've sunk into the conspiracy theory soup. So the question is, how will the proportions work out? How many people are in that conspiracy theory world, and how many people are still out there saying, I'm trying to figure out what's going on around me? And if the latter group remains strong, then there's hope.
There you go. Well, listen, thanks for joining us, Paul. Love to have you back. I could do this for hours because this is such a, it's near and dear to my heart, and it's I see it every day, and you see the disinformation that's spread in social media, and you want to know what we can do, but you also need to let the consumer know what they can do, and you spoke to that very well, and for that I thank you. The name of this show is called Reverse Shot. I'm your host, Brian Caron. Please join us next time. That's right. That's it for Reverse Shot. I'm Brian Karam, and we will see you next time. Thanks.